we're honored that John has accepted our invitation to not only do this fireside event, but do one in 2 weeks as well, part of a 2-part series on the pillars of spiritual resilience. So it's just we've had firesides here at our home for about 25 years, every first Saturday of the month for like 20 plus years, 25 years. And it was always an honor to have great speakers. But when John came from out of town or wherever he was living, I think in Connecticut as well then, we had to go to the community house and rent the community house because the crowds were so big. So we're honored to have John because he always brings game, and we always learn something. So
mute. Save your questions.
So save your questions till the end, if you would, please. And everyone mute. That would be great. And then we'll introduce John Woodall in a second.
Thanks. And I see my nephew Jason's on. Hey, Jason.
Can you hit share screen, John?
We can't see your video, John.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, sorry.
All right.
That would help.
Now introducing John Woodall. Here he is.
Thanks, sir. You know, it's
so a perfect entrance where he kind of teased us a little bit. He's probably behind the curtain there for quite a while, but here he is. So
it's even funnier than that because my talk that I just wrote out fell underneath at my immovable couch. So this is all going to be off the cuffs. So I really want to thank everyone for coming. You know, these are not easy times. They're extraordinary times. And I have to assume you're here for a reason. You know, you know, we're all going through very personal struggles. The nation's going through struggles. The world is going through tremendous tensions and struggles right now. And that said, I want to suggest that it's for a reason. It's not just, it's not some kind of punishment necessarily. It has to do with our perfecting. It has to do with humans becoming better at being human. There's a wonderful statement in my writings that talks about within each human being are gems of inestimable value. And the idea being that these struggles of life bring out those gems. And I want to use the example of what we went through here in Newtown and also in my own family's life to kind of demonstrate that a bit. And in that context, I want to tell you about a conversation I had right after the tragedy in Newtown. For those of you who are overseas or may not remember, there was a horrific school shooting here in December of 2012. And my first thoughts went to my sister Barb, who's the first in our family. I'm the 7th, so I almost don't count. There's 9 of us, and she's up on the top, and I'm buried way down on the bottom. But my sister Barb is an extraordinary human being. And in 1977, 2 of her 3 children were killed in an automobile accident. So naturally, when this horror happened in this town that we live in, my thoughts immediately went to my sister. And we spoke on the phone, and she was just the essence of grace and kindness and concern, wanted to be present for anyone she could in this community. And I knew she would be that way because that's who she is. And I bring that up because I want to dedicate this to my sister Barb. But also to say that each of us has some kind of struggle that has the capacity to make us feel quite isolated. You know, it's one of the functions of suffering is that it makes us feel exquisitely alone, right? That we're suffering uniquely and perhaps in a very isolated way. So I want to suggest that with this presentation that none of us is really alone, that the purpose of these kinds of struggles are actually to unite us and to bring us together and to bring out from us the best in us, like it has done in my sister's life. And as we're seeing every single day here in Newtown. So in a Baha'i context, just to put that in, the Baha'is have a unique kind of view of the time we're in, that this is a restructuring of the outer and inner world that we inhabit, that these struggles are intended to realign our inner lives, to make us more attuned to the best part of ourselves, those gems that I referred to a minute ago. And that ultimately these gems need to restructure the way we are in the world with each other, in creating community of another sort, of a deeper sort than what we've ever seen. So that the time we're in is a bringing down of forms of relating to each other that have caused division and instigated and fueled division and conflict, and to be replaced by a way of living where we are really united and the best parts of us have a chance to flourish. Now, let me talk a little bit about Newtown. In the days before the horrific tragedy, Margot, my wife, and I were and still are on the Interfaith Council representing the Baha'i community. And what a wonderful group of people, Jews, Christians of many sorts, Muslims, Baha'is, we've had Buddhists and Hindus, and we were always very cordial with each other, very supportive, and worked together cooperatively. But when that tragedy happened, something really, really changed dramatically. The experience of the horror of that day, and again, for those of you who may not recall, 20 children were killed, 20 first graders were killed, along with 6 of their teachers in a horrific event at the elementary school in Sandy Hook. The sense of powerlessness we all had over that event that was utterly overwhelming. There was a sense that any artifice that we had about our roles in the community, our positions, our titles, all of that was ripped from us. And before the power of the horror of this event and our powerlessness to prevent anything or to prevent it. So what was left was an exquisite vulnerability, a raw, deep, absolute pain of loss. And we all shared it. It wasn't a unique experience. It was universally shared in the town, well, in the nation and the world, really. The media was here for weeks afterwards. But in the town itself, there were concentric circles of people who experienced this, very intimately, and then with expanding circles outside that. But each of us had this sense of profound powerlessness and rawness. And I want to talk about that sense of powerlessness, because I think that's the crux of the matter. How we deal with the sense of powerlessness in our suffering is going to determine our spiritual fate, and it will determine our happiness ultimately, and our success in the world, and perhaps our spiritual fate in the next world. Now, what do I mean by that? This sense of powerlessness kind of branched into 2 expressions. On the one hand, within the Interfaith Council, there was a deep, urgent, abiding sense of compassionate love. It's so interesting. We already have had a wonderful companionship, but it became so fundamentally authentic, so rich and beyond us. It was something much larger than us. And it bound.
Yeah, sure. I'm brushing my teeth. I'll send it to you as soon as.
Who's?
Can you, whoever this is, could you please mute?
Thank you. And there's my sister-in-law. So again, this sense of forced agape. You know, the Christians talk about agape, this sense of spiritual communion. That sense of communion was not, we didn't look for it. It was cast upon us in the midst of our powerlessness, in the midst of our pain from this horror. There was a wonderful expression of this. A friend of mine named Tim Stan came up with a sign. It said, we are Sandy Hook, we choose love. And that sign was posted all over the state. But that's exactly the feeling that one group of people had, that the urgent necessity of the time was to manifest love in every possible way we could, and as authentically as we possibly could. And that began to happen. We begin to see these gems that we talked about before that are latent inside each of us started to get expressed as these wonderful examples of self-sacrificing character, people serving each other in wonderful and sacrificial ways and selfless ways, over and over and over again, knitting a new kind of community, new forms of unity and relationship that's turned now into a refugee resettlement program and all kinds of foundations and wonderful institutional acts of service and personal acts of service. All of this as a result of a horror that we felt utterly powerless before. How we manage powerlessness is the core question of our spiritual life, right? Because we have the illusion that we're in control of most of what happens to us in life. But the reality is we have very little control of our own life, of the life of our children, of the life of people whom we love, and the circumstances of our lives as well. You know, we exercise some degree of control, but at the most fundamental levels, there are strings pulling our life that we have no control over. Now, some time ago, it was 1988, I happened to be in Israel at the Baha'i World Center, and two of my ultimate heroes were there at the time. A wonderful man by the name of David Rue, who has since passed away, Dr. David Rue, and another wonderful human being by the name of Ali Nakchivani. And Dr. Rue had invited me to his home for dinner with his wonderful wife, Margaret. And I was delighted. So I was preparing to go to to dinner at the Rue's home when I ran into Mr. Nakchivani, who is my other, one of my other heroes. And Mr. Nakchivani said, "Oh, Dr. Woodall, what are you doing this evening?" I said, "Well, I'm going to the Rue's for dinner." And he says, "Ah, he said, this is what he said. He said, "Ah, Dr. Rue, there is a man who has suffered successfully. There is a man who has suffered successfully." When he said that to me, that, you know, that little emoji of the mind being blown, my mind was blown at the thought, suffer successfully? I don't want to suffer at all. You know, can you tell me how I don't have to suffer? But what weight and wisdom was in that comment to say this man had suffered successfully? So it planted a seed in me. What does that mean? What could that possibly mean? And the course of my whole career has been trying to figure that out, really, putting myself in situations where there was real powerlessness and challenge, to find out that in all of these situations, whether it's in Newtown, whether it's in my beautiful sister, whether it's in Bosnia, working with refugees there in New York City, there are gems that emerge from people who suffer successfully. There are these wonderful gifts of the spirit that Christians would say that emerge as a result of suffering successfully. So I was just talking a little bit about in Newtown, some of the signs of this suffering successfully. The first was this sense that a love was not something we possessed. It's something that possessed us. that we were welcomed into this ocean of love, that it was a gift. It was something that was, that we were brought to. It wasn't something that we deserved. It wasn't something that we had asked for in that way, certainly not in that way, but that in the midst of this suffering, there was this unfolding of love, that love, but said in a better way, that love was unfolding from us qualities that none of us could have seen in ourselves. And these qualities were being used to build a new kind of community. All right. Now, because of time, we'll go to the other side. What are the other ways to respond to powerlessness? And I'll tell you that the failure to respond to powerlessness well, to suffer unsuccessfully, is one of the things that's killing our country right now. It's killing relationships. It's killing the planet. What happens when we are confronted by a powerlessness that we feel threatened by, right? Humans don't take to powerlessness very well, whether it's financial powerlessness or someone cutting us off on the highway or someone saying something rude to us or any number of things. We respond without that kind of loving, grounding position. Without that, we respond defensively, we respond offensively, we respond in a reactive way. We respond with a fight or flight response, right? Where we want to dominate or run from whatever it is that's threatening us. So in Newtown, one of the ways this showed up is the way it shows up in any social situation where there's been great trauma. Some people will respond by herding the wagons, right? And whatever their identity group is becomes more intensified, whether it's a political party, whether it's a race, whether it's gender, whether it's a religion, whether it's an ethnic group, whatever it might be, that becomes their tribe. They rally the troops around that identity to preserve that identity. So you can see people in Newtown who've become, really quite fanatical at blaming and pointing at other groups and saying they're to blame for all these problems over here. So just as there was this new community emerging, right, there was also an intensification of finger pointing. That person is trying to get away with this, and those group over there are nothing but liars and cheats, and those people shouldn't be allowed in the country. And what are those people doing, thinking they can have a building in our town? That happened too, with a greater intensity, because it felt as though, because of this sense of powerlessness, that survival was at stake, right? So they look for enemies. Who is the person responsible for all this? So this is a great truth about suffering. Suffering either expands us into the heart of compassion, or with a heart of compassion, we become larger, or we become smaller and we become more rigid. Right? So we've seen both in Newtown. I would suggest we're seeing both in this country right now. We are not suffering well. We are not suffering successfully. Whenever you see signs of blame, of categoric labels of another, these sorts of people are like this. They're all like this. That's the beginning of great oppression. That's the beginning of justifying pogroms, of holocausts, of you name it. So any kind of categorical thinking that places an entire group as the bad people, that's a bad sign, right? And we're seeing it every single day, and it's amplified on social media, on the television. Extract yourself from those things. If you want to be spiritually resilient, the characteristic of spiritual resilience is the opposite of that rigidity. It's the opposite of that need to find people to blame. It's the opposite of that. It's moving with humility into a larger sense of identity. And we urgently need that. We urgently need that in our personal lives and in the nation and in the world. So that's one key point I wanted to bring up. Now, I was joking with Tom just before we started. I said, you know, we should start the program by offering apologies first, because to cover all of spiritual resilience in 35 minutes is like covering all of spirituality in 35 minutes. But so I'm trying to get at the crux. And the crux is, again, this point of how we manage powerlessness. Do we fall into a sense of entitlement and us them thinking? Or do we fall into a state of grace and become larger? Now, I want to talk psychologically just for a minute, if you don't mind. One of the things that happens when we suffer is that we feel that we're the only person suffering. Suffering has a way of making us feel very intensely us, right? It intensifies our identity, right? So it's hard to imagine anyone else could suffer the way we're suffering at that particular moment, or that. So this is a sort of a human trait. It's also a bit of a trap. It's one of the things that develops certain kinds of depression. It's also the sort of thing that creates unnecessary isolation. It also is sort of the fodder for that us them thinking. Now, ironically, it's also the thing that's needed for us to call ourselves to account, to ask if we've been living in a way that brought this onto ourselves. So we're stuck in this kind of dyad between how much of this is my fault, but who did this to me? So we're in this kind of inner, if you're not a sociopath, you're in this inner dialogue about, did I do this to myself, or who did this to me? So, but it's all about I. It's all about I, right? Some of that's a necessary self-examination, but some of it is a being entrapped in our identity by suffering. Does that make sense? I hope it does. I think that's everyone's experience. So here's a key. You know, in the book of Genesis, it begins with the 7 days of creation. And at the end of God creating the heavens and the earth, he says he looks upon his creation and saw that it was good. He didn't look on it and see that it was blameworthy and horrible and deserving punishment. He looked on it and it was good. In the first verse of the Quran, it says, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. It doesn't say in the name of God, the vengeful, the wrathful, right? The punishing and the cruel. It says in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. The Buddhists talk about the ground of existence being that of compassion. Right? The point I'm making is, psychologically, one of the things that prevents us from moving into that state of grace, that our identity expands from our suffering, one of the things that prevents that is that we feel that if we really let go of our identity, of our ego, that we will become annihilated, that we will cease to exist, that we're being, our suffering is pulling us to something larger. It's pulling us to something to make us bigger, but we don't see that. We see that we're being annihilated. So because of that, we resist change. We resist grace. We resist love. Because we feel we need to control the thing that's hurting us. And that's when we revert to identities like race or religion or political party or gender, these things, to try to regain control of something we feel out of control about. All right. I wanted to talk a little bit in the last couple of minutes about the features of resilience. This first point being that there is a choice when we suffer, a choice that brings us to this kind of rigid identification where we become a person who's looking for someone to blame for what's wrong, whether it's us or someone else, or a person who falls into this state of grace, who's motivated by love, who has a sense of profound humility at these huge forces in life, and as a result wants to be of service to others. We're in a year that's the centenary of the passing of someone by the name of Abdul Baha. He talked about this notion of love as a kind of a covenant between each of us and God, between humanity and God and each of us to each other. How is it that we allow this sense of love to grow and to bring out more of the best of human nature? How do we allow that to happen? And I'm convinced that one of the ways to do that, especially watching my sister and also watching the people in Newtown, is that the way to do that is through a humble service, the looking for ways to expand love in the lives of someone else. So, for instance, in Abdul Baha's life, muted. Oh, did everybody hear me? I just noticed I was muted. I have no idea how that happened.
Just a few words were cut out.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. In Abdul Baha's life, one of the things you notice is that he suffered pretty much everything you can imagine. He was an exile from childhood. He suffered starvation, horrible cold, homelessness. He was imprisoned. Constant lies told about him before officials who could have him killed, constant threat of death for 77 years. And what was astounding about that is that he spent pretty much every waking moment serving other people. And it occurred to me the other day that where you and I have to kind of grow to the place where we see that service to others is necessary for our spiritual growth, Abdul Baha turned each one of these sufferings into service. He didn't wait for an instruction to serve others. And I wonder if one of the reasons he served as diligently as he did is that he knew that his own pain needed to be turned into this compassionate love. And that's the way to do it, through service. You know, he lost 5 of his sons as a result of the imprisonments and the hardships that his family endured. And when the tragedy happened in Newtown, I read, my wife and I read a letter that he wrote to a woman who had lost a child, because he understood what that was like. He lost 5 children. So it's this notion that taking our suffering and turning it into compassionate service, that is the hallmark of resilience. That's the goal. That's where we're headed. But there's something about Abdul Baha that he got that from childhood, whereas you and I, we need to grow into that understanding. But an experience like what happened in Newtown showed us that not just as a theology, not just as a belief system, but that as an urgent necessity, that compassionate service to others is like breath. It's the thing that keeps the spirit alive. Right? Our inner life depends on compassionate service to others. It's not just a good idea. It's the only thing that really keeps us in a condition of spiritual health. So I wanted to make that point. You know, Abdu'l-Baha wrote an interesting, it's called a tablet, but it was a letter basically to the Baha'is of New England, of the northeastern states. And in it, he said that every region of the world has its own unique properties and gifts. But one of the gifts of this part of the country was that it excelled in faith and assurance. And he mentions that twice in this letter. And I thought, faith and assurance. Well, Abdu'l-Baha often said that people had qualities that they didn't have yet, but they could have. So he was often telling them what they could be, but they weren't yet. But he'd see it in them and say, you're a very courageous person, when they were cowering over something. But then it got them thinking about courage. And then before you knew it, they practiced courage and they became courageous. So he says that this part of the country is endowed with faith and assurance. And I was thinking how, we have a belief or a faith that we should be of loving service to each other, or we have a faith that God is always there for us, but we don't have an assurance of it. An assurance is a living, abiding sense that that's just true. It's not a belief. It's far more than a belief. It's a living reality, right? I'll tell you one last story, and then I'll close. There was a Baha'i in the end of the last the 1800s. His name was Haji Akund, and he was a very well-known Baha'i in Persia in the 1800s. And the Baha'is were blamed for everything. So whenever anything went wrong, the Baha'is would be blamed. So whenever something bad happened in Tehran, or he knew that they would be coming for him because they would blame him, or they'd blame the Baha'is. So he would get dressed up in his best clothes and wait for them to come arrest him. And sure enough, they would. They'd come and they'd arrest him. And this one time, they took him to the Siachal, the same prison that Baha'u'llah had been to, and annexed to that dungeon. And the Shah's torturers tortured him for days. And these aren't your average torturers; these were the Shah's torturers. So they were the best in the realm. And through all these tortures, he never cried out. He never whimpered. And so they were puzzled by this. So they actually said, well, we've got to get the Shah down here to see this. This isn't normal. So they dressed him up in this finery, and they put it this this beautiful kind of embroidered drop cloth behind him. And then they invited the Shah to come down to take a look at this guy who they've been torturing and never cried out. So actually, one of this man's descendants lives not too far from where Margot and I live. And they tell the story that when the Shah came down into the dungeon, he looked across around the doorway to see him sitting in this chair majestically looking like he's the Shah. And the Haji Akund called out to the Shah and said, Your Majesty, you don't have to be afraid. I'm in chains. I can't move. So you don't have to be afraid of me. The reason I'm telling you this story is that man had something that is possible for all of us. We like to turn people like that into heroes and say that they're some kind of a special being, but no, yes, but he became that. He found this ocean of love that he was able to live in. Right? It wasn't just faith that he believed in. It was an indwelling reality for him. And so there was no external event that could shake his internal state. That's the critical point. There was no external event that could shake his internal condition. That is the condition of assurance, of spiritual assurance. None of us is there. Well, I'm not there. Hopefully some of you are, but we're all moving from faith to assurance. We're on this road from faith to assurance. And it's not a failure on our part if we're afraid or if we make mistakes along the way. We are together. We are all moving along this path. So I'm saying this, to validate the process, that that when we feel powerless, it's not because we made a mistake, it's because we are being brought to the ocean of love. We are being maybe kicking and screaming, but that we're being brought to our spiritual inheritance. What's being called from us is a letting go of who we think we are, so that we can move into something larger about who we are in the deepest sense of who we are. Right? There's an unfolding that's being asked of us. And there is a kind of sacrifice that's required of us. Just like a parent, you get married and you have kids, and suddenly you are not the person you thought you were 10 years ago, because you got to get up at 2 a.m. and change, feed the baby. So you become something else because of sacrifice for something you love. And in the largest sense, that's true in each of our struggles in life, that if we approach it with the sense of, there is a love that's calling me through this, right? There is a love that I have access to that can help me unfold through this. I hope I'm saying that well. I'm sure I'm not. Again, the point being, and then I will open it up, is that our suffering is intended to bring out these gems from us. Our suffering is intended to bring us to a sense of assurance that we are never out of the ocean of love. We are never, the river of life is never far from us. We are always in the river of life, even when we feel we're not. Right? So trusting in that and developing a sense of knowing that is a large part of what spiritual practice is about, and what spiritual resilience is about, is knowing that you abide within that ocean of love at all times, and that is your protection. Okay, there's so many things to say, and again, like I said, I dropped my notes under the couch, so that was all improvised, as I'm sure was apparent. All right, everyone, let's let me open it up and take whatever questions you might have, and hopefully we'll clarify some things.
Yeah, so John, maybe people can introduce themselves when they ask the question, and then everyone else stays on mute, and then take a turn, because we want to make sure that people are muted as much as possible. So I'll let you be in charge of that, though, John. So just to kind of make sure we keep a flow.
Excellent. So let's see. If I look at the chat, is it okay? Oh, no, everyone's saying please mute. Okay.
Yeah.
Any questions or?
Raise your hand.
It's raise your hand and we'll call on you.
See hands.
Laird, please.
Well, I'm glad you dropped your notes in the couch. It was very beautiful. And I'm very grateful to Tom and Susan for inviting us to listen to you. And I really have nothing to say. I just wanted to tell you how grateful I am for such a powerful message. And thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm very grateful.
Here. Here she. Oh no. Oh, here, Lynn has a question.
Oh, Lynn, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a comment on the whole thing of grief and feeling that flow of love. When we are confronted with situations like that, it becomes so personal. We can never imagine somebody else's grief or what they're going through. So I think that it's important that we are empathetic and we do surround them with love, but we don't personally have to take on the grief that they're feeling or feel that we understand it. Because, you feel like you have the right to say, like, oh my, how can you fathom going through that? And you feel there is an anger that's involved with tragedy when things happen that are out of your control, that you do feel is unfair. So I guess what it is they say that God doesn't give us more than we can endure, or it's such a personal level that we come to those things on.
So much packed in what you said. Yeah, I agree. I think there are certain pains that sure feel like they're more than you can endure. Um, uh, but there's different I's involved, right? There's the I that I think that I am, and then there's the I that I really am, or that God intends for me, right? I don't think that I has any limitations, and whatever providence bestows on us, that I can handle it. But the little I that I think I am, oh yeah, that can get crushed, and it does get crushed, right? Probably it gets crushed until I decide to become bigger, right? Or let go. This is really what humility is seeing. I had a friend in Bosnia when I worked in there who said, you know, this war taught me my measure. And what he meant by that was what he did have power over and what he didn't, and where he was powerless and had to be humble, right? Had to let go. And that letting go, I think, is really the learning when that letting go happens is really most of what wisdom, the acquisition of wisdom is about. When do you apply yourself to be assertive? When does God want you to be assertive? And when do you need to let go? There's no formula for that. We have to kind of figure it out, right? So it requires humility, and it requires like a constant return to this sense of turning to the source, turning to God and asking for guidance, asking for help, which means you're open to possibilities, but it also means you're letting go of your idea about who you are and what might happen, so that you can see something unfolding. One of the problems with angry or fearful reactions to struggle is that nothing new is allowed to happen. There no new way of looking at things, no new possibility in a relationship, for instance, is possible, because anything different is crushed because it's threatening, and or because we want something to be the way we see it, right? So, you know, think of the marriages that end because when someone's trying to change, the other person's so upset about something that happened that any evidence of change is crushed. So we're in these vicious cycles of creating more and more and more pain, and more and more and more alienation and powerlessness and oppression. Happens in families and couples, happens in towns, in the nation, and in the world. So so a spiritual change in the world isn't just a belief system. It's not a belief system. Well, okay, there's things we need to believe that are true, but it's much more a reorientation of the mind and the heart, right? Approaching life with a humility. I'm going to tell you a story. I wasn't going to do this, but now I'm going to tell you a story. In 1990, I arrived in the Boston area and was running a trauma clinic at a VA hospital. And the psychologist who was my partner, we were talking one day and saying, you know, we're only getting like the cherry-picked veterans, the ones who really don't need us that much. The ones who really need us, where are they? And Mike said, well, you know, they're in homeless shelters. Okay, well, let's go to a homeless shelter. So right at that time, a homeless shelter had opened up in Boston, and I'm not making this up. This should be a movie. A group of about 30 veterans, homeless veterans, took over an abandoned bank building, and they called a press conference and they said, because you've treated us so badly, we're taking this over and we're trained killers, so try to take it away from us. They said that on television. And so they took over this 7-story abandoned bank building. Actually, the city gave it to them for like $1. And they set up shop in there. It's like the Wild West. And veterans from all over the country poured into this place. Hundreds of homeless veterans showed up in this place. So And these guys hated the VA because the VA was, they didn't feel was fair to them. So of course, where did we go? To the New England Shelter for Homeless Veterans. And we went into the front door and we said, look, we're from the VA. We want to see if we can help. And they said, get the F out of here. And they threw us out. And every week we'd go back and every week they'd throw us out. And for a couple of months that went on until one day we went in and said, we're here again. And they said, and the guy said, just a second. He says, go up to the second floor to the bunker and ask for George and do whatever he tells you to do. So the bunker was this room where these about 30 veterans hung out in there. And these guys were severe PTSD, severe combat experience. And George was a reporter from Argentina who'd been through the big disappearance in Argentina, and he had been tortured and things, and he came to the United States, and he was sort of shepherding these veterans. So we went up there and we started a clinic. And we was in it literally was a closet that we put a little table in, and I'd sit on one side and the vet would sit on the other. They'd close the door in this little closet, and we did therapy. So every time I'd come out, there was this tall guy standing there about 6'5", and he'd be staring right at me at the end of every day. And he wouldn't say a word, he'd just look right through me and just piercing eyes. And after a couple of weeks of this, he looked at me and said, hey, Doc, I want to talk to you. And I thought, either my career is ending or it's beginning. I'm not quite sure. So we began this conversation. Now, he had been a tank commander in Vietnam. Before that, he was a very accomplished painter. And he told me one horrific story after another. And he told me about how he had, well, he showed me these paintings that he had done. After the war, he had stayed in the military because he felt that there was no community he could be in to talk about his life, because how do you explain to a wife or that your most profound experience is horror, right? How do you have a relationship when your emotional life has been destroyed and your sense of purpose has been, destroyed? He thought he was going to defend democracy, and he had to do things that were unspeakable. So, but he felt a camaraderie amongst these veterans. So he stayed on. He wound up being the cultural attaché of NATO in Europe. So he was the guy who organized trips to museums when troops were on passes, or when a general was coming somewhere, he'd arrange the tours and things. Then when the first Gulf War happened, he was one of the guys responsible for moving material to Kuwait and to Iraq. And when that 100-hour war was over, he was in this debriefing room with a group of other people who'd done that work. And this major from the Pentagon came in to debrief them. And the first thing out of his mouth was, well, you men did a great job, and you made up for that piss poor job we did in Vietnam. Well, to him, that broke something in him, because the military was the only thing holding him together. And for someone from the Pentagon to tell him that what he did didn't mean anything, he just snapped. So he stood up, he walked out of the room, he walked to the airfield, which is right there. He got on the first plane to Boston, and for 2 years, he was walking the streets of Boston. And I was the first civilian that he spoke to. Now, while he was doing this art work in Europe, being the cultural attaché, he visited something called the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Pergamon is a place in Anatolia in Turkey, and it was a mirror city of Athens, devoted to Athena, same kind of Acropolis, same kind of building. And a German archaeologist took the whole thing apart and moved it to Berlin in the 1880s. And the frieze on this building depicts a beautiful sculpture, depicts a battle between the Titans and the gods. And this one particular, and you've probably seen it, it's a sculpture of the goddess Athena. And she has this huge Titan, this big puffed up Titan. She has him by the hair. And she can do with him whatever she wants because she's Athena. And so these Titans are these puffed up big humans who are running the world. The long story short is the Titans lose to the gods, and then the gods give the planet, give Earth to humans. So when he was in Vietnam, he kept painting, and even still, he was painting this scene of a woman having this control over a man where he was powerless and she had all the power. And so this sense of powerlessness, he's painting it over and over again and showing me these paintings. And we came to an interpretation that said that, you know, life will control you. There's certain things you have no power over. And you're like that big Titan who thinks he's so powerful, but Athena's got you by the hair and she can do anything she wants with you. So then the question was, what does that have to do with you? And what does that have to do with Pergamon, that town? So we thought that what that meant was, what would the stance be? How should we respond to that powerlessness? And in the course of our conversation, it became this notion of humility before these great powers, this sense of compassion and our need to be of service to others and to be each other's well-wishers, that was what made life worth living. And interestingly, once we got to that point, he called his family and went back home. Now, the interesting thing is, we also talked about how at Pergamon was also a democracy. So why would they have that on their temple? Well, it was to say that if you're going to have a democracy, you have to deal with your powerlessness in a way that leads you to humility and care for each other. Otherwise, democracy won't work. And it won't work in a town like Pergamon, and it won't work in a country like the US or the world without that sense of fellow feeling and humility, right? And we have the opposite of that now. We have rage and finger pointing. Now, the figure of Abdu'l-Baha comes up in this, in that in Pergamon, you had this city-state that needed that lesson. And in Abdu'l-Baha, I highly recommend you read something about his life. I think we have an example of a life lived that is that kind of a metaphor for this time, that every manner of suffering he experienced and always responded with this compassionate sense of service. So we know it's possible. So I think each of us is really called to how do we move from a sense of faith to the sense of assurance, where that becomes our motivating force, our motivation. How do we increase our capacity to not be moved by reaction, but to be moved by loving compassion? And that is a covenant that we share. It's a covenant that makes us a community, right? A beloved community in its best form, if we can pull it off. But we need that in our families, in our communities, in the nation, and the globe. All right, friends.
Deborah Davis had a question, I think.
Oh,
Deborah?
thank you. Hi, John. Thank you for inviting me.
Deborah, good to see you.
I love the part that you were talking about when you said that how this suffering can either build grace or build fanaticism and make people tribal and go into themselves and blame. And obviously we've been seeing that. And it's funny because last night I was listening to an interview with Dr. Joe Dispenza. I don't know if you ever heard of him,
No.
but he said something, and this is my question. He said that if you want to divide us as a community, he's a neurologist, I think, or a neuroscientist. He goes, all you have to do is captivate them first with messages, with fear, emotion, and anger. And he goes, once you've captivated them, then you get to decide the solution. So obviously half of our nation has been captivated by anger, fear, just like you said. And I feel like they're always winning. And our little world that we're in right this moment is losing this battle because we're not captivating anybody. I mean, it seems like it's so much easier to captivate, like you said, with those negative emotions. So how do you suggest that love and humility and growth and community, like you talked about so eloquently, how do we win and captivate people
Holy
to
cow.
follow you?
Well, big, but well, I don't know about me, but great question. First of all, great to hear your voice and not
Thank
just
you.
on Facebook. I think we're in trouble. I think we're in big trouble.
I know.
The social media, it follows, and a lot of media outlets follow a simple formula that's been known for 100 years. You say two positive kitty cat kind of warm things. You know, you show a kitty cat, you show a mother taking care of her child, and then you say these sorts of people don't like this, you know. And so now you have two emotional reactions where anybody would love kids and kittens. And now, you mean these people don't like that? And so you just keep doing that. You just keep doing it over and over and over again. And before you know it, these people are evil, right? And now you can tell the crowd, well, therefore we have to prevent these people from this, and right? So it's a strategy. It's been followed for over a century for, you know, in political manipulation and advertising. So I actually think we've got to, like, you know, liberate our brains. You know, I mean, limit social media, I think is a good idea. Limiting social television's a really good idea. News outlets and things that, you know, whenever there's somebody to blame and you're pissed, it's time to turn the channel, right? Because you're being manipulated. So that's my take. But how do we fill the positive? I really think it's funny because I used to think very globally. We need these big movements and stuff. And more I think, yeah, we do. But what we really need are neighborhoods. We need communities. We need local strengthening of connections at the very intimate personal level. In this room where we're sitting right now, we have Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and Christians and we all learn a little bit about, we'll have a topic that we discuss. And I almost always started with a short little brief text from all of their sacred literature. And the reason is not to try to promote anybody's religion, but it's like everybody in the room knows a text from somebody else's religion and they've met somebody from the other religion. So if somebody says, oh, all those Muslims are this, and they go, well, no, they're not. I just met one. And they don't say that, they say this. So they have real knowledge. So that kind of intimate connection is, I think we have huge opportunities with stuff like in your home, you know. So I think that's the, you know, with the COVID thing, it's kind of a challenge, but maybe it's lightening up a bit. But I really think that's where the money is intimate kind of connections locally. You know, keep it, because all this stuff out here, part of what makes you anxious is that I don't have any control over what they're saying in Washington and they're doing in Minneapolis. I don't have any control over that. So it makes you more nervous. You feel powerless again. So the point is to go to your sphere of power. Where do you have influence? And so my take is make it personal, make it intimate, and at least make your neighborhood or your community powerful, you know.
Jeff, did you have a question, Jeff?
Yes. Thank you, John.
Hey, Jeff.
I really am deeply moved by you and your loving insights.
Yes, thank you.
My name is Jeff. I live in Hadley, Massachusetts, and I am, to be very frank, personally challenged with aversion and reactivity. I don't know about my other brothers and sisters here, but I would guess that sometimes they have some aversion or reactivity. And if you could spend some time and really, how do we deal with reactivity and aversion? And I'll be even a little specific. I look at all the presidents we've had since I voted for Bill Clinton. He did the NAFTA agreement, 80 million factory jobs abroad. I can mention president after president. I am powerless. I can vote. We see what's going on with these two parties. I saw the Iraq war with God knows how many 100,000 plus people were slaughtered, elders, babies. And I have aversion toward George Bush for doing that. I forgive him also at the same time. I know he's a child of God with a soul. I understand all of that. But on a human level, how do I let go of aversion and how do I let go of reactivity? And I'm not trying to ask you a question that's impossible to answer, that you've already touched on in some very beautiful ways. But I still want to ask you, because I'll never have this opportunity again. How do I deal with aversion? And how do I deal with reactivity? Because it does come up.
Well, so that I'm reminded of the story of Gandhi, who someone came to him and said, Bapu, can you teach me how to quit smoking? And he said, yes, I can, but you have to come back in a month. And he said, well, okay. So 30 days later, he came back to Gandhi and said, Bapu, it's a month. You said you'd teach me how to quit smoking. Will you teach me how to quit smoking? And he said, yes, I will. And then the guy says, well, why did you make me wait 30 days? And Gandhi said, well, I had to quit smoking first. So I feel a little bit like that. I mean, I'm as reactive as anybody, and I'm as have aversion as much as anybody. But that's the name of the game right now. That's where a life like Abdu'l-Baha's becomes so interesting, is that he never seemed to have that. So across a lifespan, how is that even possible? So a part of me is like inspired by that. Another part of me thinks, oh my God, I'm never going to make any progress. But so just knowing the example exists is really quite amazing. But I really think that, you know, if you're swimming in a river, you know, you're swimming close to the bank, the water's not moving too quickly. But if you move to the middle of the river, it can be a pretty quick current, and you have to swim a lot harder to stay in place, let alone to make progress. I feel that that's happening in the world right now. Events are accelerating and things are becoming more reactive and more aversion creating. And so unless we're really working on building our sense of inner spiritual resilience, we're going to be swept away. So what we were doing a year ago might not be adequate for today. So that's really where I think, and this is a point I really didn't emphasize and I really need to emphasize. It's not just praying and it's not just, you know, being mindful of how you are reactive to others. It's also very much taking advantage of something our culture is not good at. And that is the strength of a group, the strength of a spiritual group or of an ethical group. When you know, when you have hydrogen and oxygen, and you might know everything there is to know about hydrogen and everything there is to know about oxygen. And even with all that knowledge, there's no way you could predict the properties of water when you put hydrogen and oxygen together. They call it emergent properties. Capacities emerge that are completely unpredictable because they only exist when those things are united in a certain way. The same thing is true with human society, and it's something our culture is not, or is maybe was better at before, but we're losing that capacity. How do we create groups of people in a neighborhood, in a business, or in a community, people of different backgrounds, and bring them together in a unity that is respectful and nurtures everyone in a way that brings out individual capacity and creates new capacity. That is, I think that's where real innovation can happen. It's one of the things we try to do in this room. We call them 21st century conversations. We're trying to develop that kind of sense of unity. I think we've done a pretty good job. Baha'is are doing this all over the world with their core activities in people's homes. I was so skeptical of it when it first came up about 25 years ago, and now I think it's absolutely brilliant. But availing ourselves to the nurturing and transformative power of a of a group that is practicing loving service, I think that I think there's a gold mine in there, because I know when I'm weak, like just in my marriage, if I'm having a bad day, I can lean on my wife, you know, or vice versa. Or if we're both needing to be we might both lean on each other but at least we're together. You know, there's a power in that. So I don't think it's possible to be completely free of whether it's aversion or reaction. Just to be aware of it is like half the battle. As long as like today is a little bit better than tomorrow or yesterday, then we're heading in the right direction. I hope that's something like an adequate answer. I apologize for it not being more.
Thank you. You don't have to apologize. You gave a
Ever, yeah.
very healing answer. Thank you.
Steve.
Really.
Steve, do you have any comments? Steve Capiz, do you have any comments about what you've heard today? Because you got a great mind. What do you think, Steve?
Steve Vance.
Oh,
Steve.
Steve Capiz,
Oh,
Steve.
yeah.
and then Steve Vance. Thank you. You on mute? Is that him? Maybe Steve Vance.
Yes. Yeah, John, I was glad to hear that you work with the VA. I worked with the VA 25 years in DC, not a huge position, but I worked for 32 years for the VA. Anyway, I think you'll agree with me that those guys, particularly the 12% that actually saw combat, learned probably to protect their own lives, the difference between deceit and the divine virtues that lead to the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit being what Abdul-Baha talked about in probably most of his talks, along with in different ways, he spoke about the one common faith. And I just wondered if you would address that, because I see, my wife and I do a lot of work in Cincinnati with the interfaith groups here, which you've been doing, which I think is the greatest thing I've seen in the 50 years I've been a Baha'i. I think it's just extraordinary. And the feeling you get there is of the Holy Spirit. All these people from all these different religions all know what the Holy Spirit is. We may not agree with each other, but we know the difference between deceit and the divine virtues. And I wish you, please speak to that.
You know, the people who paid a great price for their transformation can smell truth and what isn't. And two groups of people have probably taught me more than anyone: veterans and recovering alcoholics. So I owe a lot to what they've taught me. Again, if to survive, if you're a combat veteran, to survive psychologically, you have to have traversed, you know, several rings of hell, and you know, it's like a Monopoly board. You've got hotels on Park Place in the 9th ring of hell. You know, so you visited that a lot. So you know what the cost of deceit is. And then you also know when something is true, you live on it, you live for it. So anyway, all of that to say, the veterans and people doing 12-step programs I think are some of the finest human beings on the planet. I'm tremendously excited to see what's going on in interfaith councils. That spirit of agape, you know, right? That for those of you who are not unfamiliar with the term, it's the word used in Christianity for spiritual community. In a nutshell, it's much richer than that. But that's the notion that there is that wherever two or more are gathered in His name, there is love. That notion of love binding a group, and it being more, the group is more than the sum of its parts. As a result, it becomes enlivened and enriched. So we need to get that experience. We can't value it unless we've experienced it. So we need to create it as often as possible. So any one of these venues, whether it's you know, in a home, it's in a church or it's in a community gathering. We need to avail ourselves to agape, to the sense of spiritual communion with others. And that's self-sacrificial, that it burns with a sense of loving service. Abdu'l-Baha says, when you meet someone, you should become enamored of them, right? Which is amazing. But he says that the power of our faith really becomes ignited when we are united in spirit with each other. That's when the miracles happen. Something we don't really know yet because we haven't experienced it. We have to create those venues, make that happen, increase our sense of trust with each other, increase our sense of loving respect, and become kind of spiritual, what would we call it? Psychonauts, or what would you call a soul astronaut? Spiritual explorers. And we need that desperately now. And again, we live in a culture that doesn't value or provide space for that. If there's nothing else, if there's no other venue where you feel you can find that, call the Baha'is and see if they've got any of their core activities around. And if they're not up to snuff, help them, make it better. Or start something in your own house, or start with one person. But I think the need is critical. Even with everything that we do, I think we're in for a heck of a ride in the next years ahead. So, the more we can do, the better.
So Kitty Cat iPad, did you have a question or a comment, please?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Carol Erb, and I'm in Rochester, but we also have a little vineyard down at Cuca Lake. And because of the pandemic, we've actually been able to meet more young people than ever, and it's been really interesting. So this idea that John was talking about with neighborhood or community. So this young couple left Philadelphia in the pandemic to move out in the sticks. And I always joke, I kind of have a soup kitchen because I have a huge garden. So I'm always giving, my vegetables away, making soups. And Wu, who's the young wife, she's about 29, and she said something interesting to me. She said, there's very little out there about intergenerational relationships and friendships. And my husband jokes because Wu is like my friend now, but she's 29. So it's been an interesting experience for me too, because I have a 25-year-old daughter as well. So it's a different kind of community that's happening at our farm, just because they started to come and help us pick grapes or whatever. So I'm hoping to keep building on that. So that's been a gift from this pandemic.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if other people are finding these experiences with younger people. And it's so heartbreaking. It's so heartbreaking because they're so disenchanted.
Yeah.
They're trying to start out. The same with my daughter. And I can't compare my suffering, this idea of suffering that you've been talking about. I can't imagine being 25 or 29 through all of this. I mean, I'm 61. I've had this good life. So I'm wondering, how can I help or be more compassionate, with younger people to guide, keep making soup? I don't know.
It sounds so cool what you're doing, Carol. I have the same questions, there's some young people at the Dunkin' Donuts who we have these mini spiritual conversations all the time. And but you're right. They're just trying to find something to give them hope, in a world that is looking pretty bleak for them. And then back to what Jeff said about feeling aversion and indignant. And Lynn made a comment, there's a lot of injustice that deserves our indignation and aversion. So the trick is how do you turn that into motivation for something positive. That's the trick, so that it's not just the negative feeding your own reactivity. So it's a struggle, you know. But I think your question's critical. I don't know if there's an answer. If I was 20, I wouldn't trust anybody my age,
Right.
because of what we handed them, you know. And in fact, I found, like on Facebook and stuff, you know, I've been ripped to shreds by some young people who, you know, kind of, you know, they have notions about what my generation is, and boy, they don't hold back. But there's a fierce desire to be honest and fair, which I really admire. It's a little unwise and you know, harsh sometimes, but okay. So I'll have to just deal with that a little bit, or that's what they'll have to work on. We had our own things, but I'm actually kind of optimistic about that fierceness. They won't have any. They won't have it.
No, there's no bullshit. There's no.
Don't give me that, and they won't accept it. And like we were saying a little bit earlier, they can smell it,
Okay, stop it.
So I think, go ahead, John. Go ahead.
one more quick story. So I'm in Uganda, in northern Uganda, at a town called Barlogno, which was the site of the worst massacre of the war there in the early 2000s. I'm with a friend of mine named Solomon, and hundreds of thousands of people were massacred over the course of 26 years. New towns happened every night there for 26 years. So I was with my friend Solomon, and he was almost in tears, and he said, John, you know, there's so many levels to this tragedy, but one of the worst is that they killed all of the elders. There's no one to tell our stories. How are we supposed to know who we are as a people when there's no one to tell us what our purpose is, or where we're supposed to go, or what our lives are for? And so he was almost in tears about how urgently he saw this as an issue for the young people. And so I said, well, you know, maybe the answer is that this generation is going to have to be the people that they tell stories about 400 years from now. This generation is going to have to be the historic generation, the mythological generation. So I feel that about this generation globally. We need to do everything we can to empower them to be world changers, because we need it.
So maybe we'll close up. John or Diane, did you have a question that you wanted to ask before we close up?
Can I make some comments?
Yeah, please. We're gonna
Okay.
a few more minutes, then we're gonna close it up. I mean,
Okay,
go ahead,
I'll
John.
try to be
Thank you.
brief. I try to be brief and to the point. It's really great to listen to all the great things here. They asked Einstein what he thinks about war. And he said that we use science, we put people in uniform, and we send them to kill people they have never seen before. They also asked Einstein what he thought after we had the successful explosion of you know, a nuclear explosion. And he said, we're going back to the sling. And the Indian, I try to say a lot of things. I know you don't have the time. I try to be quick. And the Indian, the famous Indian poet said that, you know, man makes his weapons all powerful. When he wins, he will find himself defeated. And my question here is, when I look at Mannheim, and Dr. Woodall is going to correct me here if I'm not correct, who said that we have not found a way to really direct aggression to a safe harbor. And we see that being repeated throughout history.
Yeah.
We have pogroms, we have Holocaust, and so on. So this is something that, in my personal opinion, is unfortunate, because to create something, it takes a lot of energy. But to destroy something is much easier. That's beyond us. It's nature. And you know, you pick up a stone and you smash the window, and look how much longer it takes to, you know, recreate something. So in some respects, I find that it's very difficult for me to understand why great people, whether it is Abdul Baha, Baha'u'llah, all these great people who have so much greatness, and instead of being respected, they were really marginalized and they use violence against them. So in my respect, in my way, I look at, you know, the relationship of having respect for greatness and is missing, and then instead we have fear about violence that's, you know, happens too often. And I'll stop,
John, what else?
I'll stop there because I
Yeah.
don't want to go any further.
So all of human aggression in 2 minutes. You put your finger right on the core issue. How is it that human beings resort to violence when it means our extinction if we use these nuclear weapons or we kill the planet? It's utterly irrational. I would prefer the caveman with the bow and arrow to this, right? So at least he was just killing dinner, you know. He wasn't necessarily, you know, attacking, you know, another human. The answer is broad and deep. There are many facets to this. Rather than analyze the nature, the many facets of the problem, I'm going to suggest what might sound like a trite answer. And that is that human nature is designed for survival. When we are born, we are 100% wired for survival. We cry when we're hungry and cold, or we want to be cuddled. So our nature is 100% active for survival when we're born. All of those gems we were talking about, all of those higher nature aspects of humans, that are the finest elements of human socialization and intellectual capacity, and our greatest virtues, all of them are latent. They're like gems in a mine. They're there, but they're hidden. And life requires our quieting this side to allow this side to develop, whether it's quieting the sympathetic nervous system to allow the parasympathetic nervous system. I mean, you can have neurological correlates if you'd like. But the question becomes, what quiets the survival instinct and allows for the other to grow? That's really the question. All of the religions, I'll answer it as a Baha'i. All of the religions are essentially for that purpose, to give the motivating force that allows for the quieting of the animal part of the human nature, the survival of the fittest part of human nature, and to stir and nurture and activate our higher nature. When it's working the way it should. That's what religion does. That's what a spiritual path does. So what is the most fundamental element of that? And I think it has to do back to what we experienced in Newtown. The utter horror of what we experienced was so, it ripped from us any artifice that we had of having control over our lives or control over this horrific event. And we were left with this tender compassion. And then we found ways to nurture that. There's some people on this website or on the program right now, and I could name them and tell you all the wonderful things they did in that time. People all over town were looking for ways that they could support this sense of community and care for others. The answer is in there. The answer is in that. You know, if you want to be as banal maybe on one level and say it's cultivating a spirit of loving kindness, that's an answer. You know, Baha'u'llah actually says anything that stimulates a sense of loving kindness and assurance, that word assurance, is the straight path. Anything, whether it's watching a baseball game or, you know, laughing with your friends or praying with people, anything that cultivates that allows this part of our nature to grow, that's the straight path, right? So I like that. I like that idea. So we need to be creative and we need to be committed and active. That's the thing. And another notion is that once you get going in this, there are, Baha'u'llah says and Abdul Baha says, there are lordly confirmations that are waiting to assist you. That if you want to look at it in systems dynamics, that when we come together in unity, new capacities are created amongst us that we didn't know we had. So we need to start exploring what it means. We need to be uninauts. That's the word. We need to explore the powers of unity and become good at it. And if there's anything we teach our kids, it's to encourage them to become uninauts, you know, to explore the dynamics of unity and with the powers that can be released from it.
So John, we have 2 weeks to prepare for our next Q&A session with you. So we have 2 weeks to get good questions. Your answers are always incredible and your presentation makes us deep in our own thoughts and how we can grow as individuals and as a community. So we thank you very much, John, for all you gave us tonight and look forward to 2 weeks from tonight.
I just have one comment. How the heck is it that you guys don't look any older now than you did 30 years ago? That's not fair.
These are just pictures. We aren't really here.
Okay.
All right, you guys. Thanks everybody for coming, and see you in 2 weeks from tonight. And again, John Woodall, we really appreciate how you.
It was wonderful. Loved
Thank
every
you.
bit of it, John.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Everyone can unmute and clap now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Mom would be proud.
Hey, Jer.
John.
I love you, Jer.
Love you, Jen.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John.
You're very welcome. Good to see you, my dear. How are you?
I am well, John. We miss you. We miss you dearly.
I just come visit. What are you doing? Where you're in California, right?
I'm not in California now. I'm in Chicago and the Midwest. I know. Go figure, John. Go
okay,
figure.
well,
We'll connect.
So that's where I'm from, Wilmette. So you're in my old stomping grounds. So
I'd much rather be in our old stomping ground back in Southern
come
California.
visit us. We got room. Come and stay with us for a while.
I love Margo.
Okay. Good to see you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night, thank you.
I am going to hitchhike to Connecticut.
Next time.
See you, Maya.
John,
Love you all.
so John's got
Thank you.
Thanks, Sandy and Charles, for coming. Take care, everybody. Stay healthy.
Thank you.
now I can end it.
Oh, I got it.